All right. Hello and welcome, Mime Timers, to another cheeky episode of Mime Time, a show where we talk about overcoming the Asian diaspora identity struggle and becoming the best versions of ourselves, living our best lives, and all that good stuff. I'm your host, Mime, and today we have a really cool guest, Victor Zheng. Did I pronounce that right?
Correct.
Yes. Well, Victor, welcome. How are you doing?
Doing great and really excited and happy to be here.
Yes, Victor is an independent freelance filmmaker, and he's currently working with a project called American Born Chinese, which I think is really cool. And he also has a nerdy project, a channel called Team Avatar Films, where they do live action based videos based on the anime Avatar. And Victor, it's cool to have you. Thank you for reaching out to me. And I would like you to tell us a little bit about yourself.
So myself in a nutshell, again, kind of like the show that I'm working on for Disney Plus, American Born Chinese. I am an ABC. I grew up in Virginia, Northern Virginia, Tyson's Corner area to be exact, maybe about 20 minutes drive from Washington, D.C. And born and raised here, actually more so grew up with sports more so than anything else. I hope that shows. And then
Oh, baby.
and then with sports, and then after that, after sort of my high school jock period, I went to the University of Virginia where I studied history and Chinese. I thought I was going to work for the Foreign Service and in the government, and I immediately went to China after graduation, and then it was actually in China where I started to get into film and media over there, and then it just sort of spiraled into this full-time position. I mean, barely full-time, but I've been able to sort of transition into it. I've been involved in media and in the film industry since 2016, and obviously the pandemic throws a wrench into everyone's plans, but I've been able to do it full-time for about 2-ish years now. And as Mime just explained, I go from project to project. So sometimes I'm in the past year, I was in Georgia, Pittsburgh, LA, San Francisco for all kinds of projects, but everything from like small indie films to big Hollywood stuff. Um, and in all kinds of positions too. And again, this is the awkward part, because I feel like a lot of artists like hyphenated artists, you know what I mean? Like actor, producer, writer, editor, blah, 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 blah. And I am that, but I try to simplify it because ultimately you probably do need to focus. I try not to see it as like jack of all trades, but I try to present it as a Renaissance man sort of thing, because I don't want to imply that I'm a master of none. Because I do like it all. I like editing, I like acting, I like producing, I like writing, and I try to be useful as sort of a one-man production house wherever that may be. So, for example, with American Born Chinese, the way that I got connected with Disney Plus was because I have the Mandarin language background plus an academic hold on the language as well, which allowed me to be an assistant script supervisor for them. So, but yeah, I do a bit of everything, and I think that's me in a nutshell. I hope I didn't ramble too much there.
Hardly, bro. This time is all for us to just ramble about.
Gotcha.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I would like to primarily, what do I identify as? I would like to call myself a podcaster, because
Mhm.
I follow the format, and of course, being a podcaster or an online content creator or a content creator or a creative in a sense in this day and age, especially if it's online, you have to wear so many hats, right? If you don't have like a
Mhm.
production house, because so what am I as a podcaster? Okay, well, I have to edit all this shit on GarageBand and whatever. So okay, so I'm an audio engineer editor. Like I gotta set up this microphone. I don't have to do it at a super professional level, but like at a semi, competence level. And then I gotta
Definitely.
like build the website, right? I mean, it's just Squarespace. It's easy. Anyone can do it, but I got to take the time to figure that out,
Mhm.
like a noob. And then, I got to post it and then schedule it. And then, so like, I'm a content manager, and then like, I got to write out a lot of the scripts. If it's a solo episode, then, like I have all these ideas. So, I'm a writer, right? I'm a podcast writer.
Mhm.
So I'm not, and I'm the host, right? Like, I'm talking to you and I'm an interviewer, right? All these stupid titles, but you got to wear all these hats. And then, it just goes on and on and on. And then you got a network. And so Same goes for the other stuff that I do. I wear different hats outside of this. I've gone to open mics since I first came to Korea, and I stopped going for a while. But when I first came to Korea, I went to all the open mics. I did stand-up comedy and what is it? Acoustic guitar covers and some like hip hop songs that I wrote like over some instrumentals. And so what I'm trying to say is that like it's important to put yourself out there and try lots of different things and then find the thing. I'm speaking for the audience and from personal experience. What worked for me is I just tried lots of different things. I met a bunch of different people. And then eventually I somehow found myself connected to the people who gave me the opportunity to work and do something cool, which was party promoting. I became a club party promoter for 4 years at one of the hottest hip hop clubs in Seoul. And all the other things that I tried, somehow they built who I was to get along that way. And then along with the party promotion, like I found myself telling the same story because it's just something as simple as like I would meet people and they'd be like, oh, well, what's your name? Where are you from? Blah, blah, blah. And then, I'd share my story. I'd be like, yeah, I was born here, but I grew up in America and I came back 10 years ago or 7 years ago, a few years ago when I was saying this. And then I came here to find my roots and to become the best version of myself, get out of my shell, lose weight, change my fashion, blah, 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 meet girls, overcome social anxiety, build my confidence, really learn to love myself, overcome past trauma, find out who I am. And eventually people are like, wow, man, you talk a lot. Maybe you should start a podcast. And I knew that when like more than a handful of people told me, wow, man, you should start a podcast. You just don't shut the fuck up about some stuff. And so, yeah, I would just, we can move on to the next topic. But my point is like, it's good to try many different things until you find that one thing that you're really good at and that you enjoy doing. And it doesn't even have to be like your lifelong passion or whatever, but maybe you'll enjoy it enough and you'll become really good at it to the point that it'll open other doors, which it has had, going to all those open mics and networking and performing made me very socially affable. I learned a lot of social skills. And then I became a club promoter because, someone I know was like, hey, you should promote parties with us. And then I became club promoter. And then with that, like I learned like, oh, I really enjoy sharing my story. And people told me I should start a podcast. So I started a podcast. And now the podcast is opening all kinds of doors for me now. And I've also become a copywriter. So as I do the podcasting, I shill my copywriting services. And so you want to find one thing that you're really good at, of course, and then other skills alongside that will complement that. And then, you become like a full stack developer. Is that what they call it? Right. So you're like a full stack producer, you're a full stack filmmaker. You have all these other skills involved. And, so in this day and age, you can do that because we have YouTube, we have the Googles, right? And then we can educate ourselves. So this is really the most amazing time in human history to learn any skill and then other supplementary, complementary skills alongside that. And then, and so like, we have this whole decentralized information age that we live in. So you don't have to stick to one label as necessarily producer or even filmmaker, but you can do a combination of these things. Anyways, now I'm rambling on. What was your upbringing like in Virginia? Did you grow up in an Asian community? Was it tight knit? Did kids call you Chink or Gook or whatever, like they did me?
So I think I grew up in a relatively more tolerant or an area that was sort of more used to diversity. Of course, I still ran into awkward encounters, people commenting on the smell of my food or so forth. Fortunately, I haven't encountered any racist encounters or outright racist, but of course, I still deal with a lot of the typical cliches of growing up Asian American in the United States. Again, always being a minority. Of course, there was an umbrella Asian community, and there were quite a bit of Chinese Americans and Taiwanese Americans. But then, what is Asian? I mean, people from the Middle East, people from Central Asia are also Asian, and then, even people from like to use Central Asians as an example, some of them come off as white passing, but they're still Asian. So, and then of course you have South Asia, Indians, Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, people from Southeast Asia. So of course the term Asian itself is such an umbrella, diverse term that at times I'm wondering, that if I'm kind of misusing it, because the Asian American experience is so broad, because for example, after 9/11, being Indian American or Pakistani American was different from being East Asian American. They had to deal with their own set of challenges and so forth. And then obviously with COVID and recent political tensions between the US and China, now our experiences being East Asian passing is that kind of like a relatively intense moment here. In terms of my upbringing, I I wouldn't say that it was a huge struggle. Of course, I had questions about, oh, am I more Chinese? Am I more American? And then for a time, I probably was a little bit disconnected from my roots and my Chinese background. So that's why in college, I really made it an effort to study Chinese extremely hard and to study abroad in China multiple times, to not just consolidate my language abilities, but also just consolidate my knowledge of the community, the culture, and the workspace there as well. And overall, I would say that, I guess a few key memories, so to speak, was that I'd be like one of the only Asians on the football team, or one of the only Asians on the track team, or in the choir, that sort of thing. And people didn't treat me with disrespect, as opposed to, oh wow, you're a little bit unique, so to speak. And it's more of a neutral thing versus a positive or a negative thing as well. Of course, like some people were curious, some people asked, polite professional questions, some people asked awkward questions, like, if I eat feet or eat dog, that sort of thing. But I didn't run into anything malicious until and again, as an adult in the US, I haven't run into anything. But of course that, you can see it in the media that anti-Asian hate is a reality that's probably risen because of COVID and political tensions. I think interestingly enough, and I wonder if you've experienced this to an extent being Korean born, but in China, I've encountered some backlash for being American born. And there was a lot of explanation of, or whenever I kind of got into that social discussion, there was a lot of social gymnastics and a lot of explaining that I had to do to my local Chinese peers, because again, sort of like the hyphenated identity, we're talking about that in a professional context, but the hyphenated identity, like Asian American, Chinese American, it's not really a particular concept in China, because in China it's like we're all one, we're all Chinese. And of course China has diversity with 50 plus minorities, but the majority of people are Han Chinese, basically what I am. I'm ethnically Han. And so when I explained that I'm Chinese American, the Chinese people that I talked to, they was like, hey, that's cheating. It's like claiming two identities. You can only claim one. You're either American or Chinese. So it was interesting. When I was in China, I had to explain that concept a lot. While in the US, though, I wouldn't say that it's well understood by everyone I talked to. People didn't seem to mind it as much, so to speak. So I would say that's my upbringing in a nutshell. Just being a minority, sometimes being treated like a model minority. To share like one quick anecdote, was that one time I was stopped by the cops for actually driving too slow. I'm a slow, not aggressive driver. So I was driving back from college late at night, and then I got pulled over. And then when the cop looked at me, he didn't address my race directly, but he's like, oh, it's fine. And then he just let me go after barely talking to me. So it's just, that was sort of a weird, I can't prove it to be sure, but I wonder if the model minority concept helped me in that particular instance. It's not a great reality, because, the model minority concept means that, the majority uses Asians as sort of, okay, you have to be like Asians, Asians are the good minority and so forth. But that was sort of weird. And I wonder if I was Black or Hispanic or any other minority, would that cop have treated me differently? But I'm not entirely sure.
Yeah, or maybe he wasn't racially profiling enough, because maybe he could have suspected that you were a sexually repressed serial killer, right? Because there's some of that reputation, like the Virginia Tech shooter and all that bullshit. that is definitely interesting, and I think we would be remiss to say that that doesn't play an influence, and the minority stereotypes, right? Like people do have these conceptions, prejudices, call it a positive thing or a negative thing. It does play a role in how people view individuals, for good or for bad. And so I think the important thing, for me personally, I used to take things very personally growing up, if people, because like I knew that like I was different. I was like the only Asian person for miles in my neighborhood or going to school. I was like the only Asian kid in elementary school in some of my classes, and I knew people treated me differently. And like a lot of times it was something neutral, but I was like coming from like a negative framework because like I was a very depressed, angry, confused kid. So I always, like was like I had my guard up, and so like I was always thinking like, oh, people don't like me because I'm Asian. Like I had that mentality, or I really believed that. And but a lot of times most people are good, or they don't mean anything bad. But like I would take it really I would take offense to like the tiniest of things. And I long story short, growing up, I realized like, I don't need to take things so personally, because I realize it's killing me. It's like I realized people weren't just treating me different because I was Asian. They treated me different because my name is weird too. My name isn't even Asian, right? My name is Hebrew. Ma'im is water in Hebrew and Arabic too, I believe. So it's not, so even Korean people, right, would be like, oh, that's interesting. He's got a unique name. His name is Mime. That's not a Korean name. So it's funny because growing up in America, people assume that it's a Korean or Asian name, Mime. And then when I go to Korean American church, or immediately going to be like, oh, Mime. That's not, that's an interesting name. That's not like Minsu or something like that. Mime. Oh, that's interesting. And so I one of the greatest gifts with my name, which I hated my name as a kid growing up because kids make fun of you. They're like, oh, you're like the Pokemon, Mr. Mime, or my name is spelled M-A-I-M. So they say, hey, Mame, right? They wouldn't, which is, a verb, which means to dismember, right? To remove a limb, someone's limb or something like that. So I was very confused, and I hated my parents for giving me this stupid name. But now I realize it was one of the greatest gifts that they could give me, because one, it's great branding, Mime Time, it rhymes with time. So I can just call my podcast Mime Time. And then the other reason is because it taught me how to not take things seriously, because I realized it wasn't my fault or my parents' fault. It was just like the way people had perceived me, right? If I was the only Asian kid in the neighborhood, maybe they were curious. And so like I was weird, not weird, but unique or different. So of course, they would see an Asian person. Maybe I was the first Asian person they ever met. So then maybe if I were them, maybe I would be a bit curious too. And be like, oh, this kid's name is mine. That's kind of weird. But anyways, going back to what you said about, that's really interesting that in mainland China, you were. What age did you like go to China to like, get deeper into your Mandarin or get in touch with your roots? Like, was that in your teenage years or what?
I lived there for about 2 years in elementary school, but then I came back as an adult. My first time was in 2014. I did a summer abroad there in Shanghai at East China Normal University. And then I came back again when I graduated in 2016 to work in Beijing for about 2 years. And then I worked in Shanghai for 2 years. And then I was actually working on this big propaganda film in Manchuria before the pandemic broke out in China for the first time.
Ooh,
so it's been a lot of back and forth. Yeah. I mean, the Chinese film industry is controlled by the government. So there's that whole interesting dynamic there whenever you work in anything there media related.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised at all. It's, of course, it's got to be. Why wouldn't it be? Okay, could I look this up? Could I find this Manchurian propaganda film?
Oh yeah. So it's already been released. They released it in 2 parts. It's called The Battle of Lake Changjing. I think it's in Korean, it's Chosan Reservoir.
Oh, is this like
it's the famous battle in the Korean War?
Yes. No. Okay. I've heard about this. Yes, I saw it like on one of those evil Western pig YouTube videos that talk shit about China. I'm pretty sure they mentioned it and they poke fun at it. But okay, that's really
funny.
cool.
Yeah.
No, that's really interesting. And you know, like I'm fascinated by China, right?
Mm.
By the modern country and geopolitics and the past and the history. And so one day, like I would love to learn Mandarin and then as well as Cantonese and maybe some of the other like, you know, like Shanghainese and random stuff. Like, cause I think, you know, China is super diverse and it's so complex and fascinating to me. So I would love to go someday, maybe not now, but you know, I love all cultures and all peoples. And I think it's really interesting that, you know, you would meet some Chinese people and they're like, that's cheating. You
Mhm.
can't be hyphen. You can't have two identities. It's endearing, right? I hear that I'm like, oh, they think that way. That's and they mean it. And you know what? It's not like I don't want to judge it as like wrong. It's just maybe they don't know any better. And you know, what do you think they meant when they said that's cheating? You're either Chinese or American, you can't be both. What kind of place do you think they were coming from? Were they coming from jealousy, or were they coming from like it's a detriment for you to be kind of split in your cultural energy or your composition? Like, what do you think they meant by that?
And I think, not to overanalyze it, but I probably will. It just comes from this idea, since China, for the most part, is pretty homogenous. Like, it's linguistically and culturally diverse, but ethnically, most people are Han. You know, a Han person in Manchuria and a Han person in Guangdong, they speak different dialects, but ethnically, we kind of look the same. And it's just a concept that, you know, their patriotic education system, they're taught that everyone who's ethnically Chinese is Chinese. So it's interesting because, for example, the Chinese community abroad, the mainland Chinese see the Malaysian Chinese as Chinese. Not they're seen as Chinese people that live in Malaysia, even though they're culturally Malaysian. They probably speak Malay, English before they speak Mandarin, and even then, like, you know, like Cantonese and Hokkien are probably more likely to be spoken by the Southeast Asian Chinese community versus Mandarin. And another interesting example is, for example, my brother-in-law is Vietnamese American, but my family calls him Vietnamese. My extended family in China does not call him Vietnamese American. They're like, oh, he's Vietnamese, because in China they're just sort of taught that identity is tied to your ethnicity. And then so when you add that hyphenated identity, you know, you say Asian American, Chinese American, Vietnamese American, it's a brain overload. They're like, that's not possible. And it's interesting because the Chinese people, you know, I'm using that term generally. You know, Chinese people raised and born in China and educated in China. You know, when you explain what kind of the African American concept or the concept of African Americans, you know, they're saying that, oh, they're just Africans. But you know, they're so separated from Africa culturally, geographically. And I'm not trying to speak as an expert on African American culture, but I'm just using that as an example of how Chinese people that I've met, born and raised in mainland China, how they sort of digest this concept. So again, if is it coming from a place of jealousy? I mean, maybe in like individual circumstances. I think it's just more so confusion, and more so that another metaphor I heard a lot is that they saying like it's like having two wives, or it's like having two partners, or it's like having two set of parents. It's
Okay,
like it's
so
too privileged to do. It's seen as a weird privilege that you're not supposed to have. So it's something that I've always thought about, and I have discussed with a lot of friends as well. And again, I mean, it's just, as I said, I would just kind of conclude it as that. And I don't know about Koreans and Japanese, but I've always understood it as, I think in East Asia, the idea of identity and ethnicity has always been tied. So that's why China is described as like an ethnocentric state.
yeah, that's fascinating.
Mm,
That has not been my experience in Korea.
mm,
Because I've yeah, it's interesting. I've never met a Korean person who said like that's cheating or it's privileged or like that they gave me that kind of vibe.
or even like they
You'll
didn't say it's weird or anything.
to have two identity. Maybe I never approached the conversation in that way. Like I am
Mm,
Korean and American. I have two identities, so maybe I never was able to trigger an old man into telling me what I should or who I should be or what I am. Maybe I
mm,
should, right? That would be an interesting conversation. But I found that it's you know there's a within Korean society, within the older people and the younger people, like there's a spectrum, right? There are people who say, I've met people my age or a bit younger and older who would see me as Korean. But then there are people who would see me as a foreigner, and like I'm not a Korean citizen anymore, anyways. And so like there are people who will say like, you're Korean, right? There are people who will be like that, no matter what, you're Korean. And then there are other people who will be like, it's like, you'll never be Korean. And not that they'll say it in a negative tone or whatever. But in a sense, like, there's truth to all these different sides. There's like a ray of truth, or like a perspective that has validity from each of these different interactions that I have based on those persons' like life experiences and how they view themselves in the world. And so I think they all have some validity. It's like, yes, I'm Korean. I was born here, so I'm Korean blood, and my parents are Korean, so I come from a Korean family. And now I speak Korean, although I didn't grow up speaking Korean. So I went through a particularly unique journey, and that's why like I have this friggin' podcast, because I talk about my unique story because I'm a special snowflake. But really, I have not met anyone who grew up in America not speaking Korean, but then they came back to the motherland to learn their mother tongue and get in touch with their culture, only to finally come to the conclusion like, oh, I'll never be one of the mainlanders. I'll never be like, a native Korean. And in that sense, so like, I'll never be quote unquote, here's another hyphen, Korean, right? Like you might say Chinese. Oh, he's not Chinese American. He's just Chinese, right? I don't know if you guys say this, but we say it. Oh, he's just Korean. And so like I'll never be Korean, but because I am a Korean American. But even then, that's not as like a completely solid term. But anyways, I'm rambling on here. My point being is that I consider myself both. I consider myself both. I'm Korean. The elements of me, right, like ethnically and culturally, I love chopsticks and noodles and rice. Go figure. Like I appreciate some form of hierarchy, like respecting elders and the Korean way of doing things. Like I like doing it just because it makes me feel like I'm part of a bigger family. And I appreciate the tradition because I feel like these are a gift to us. Actually, I don't want to look at it negatively, like, oh, like I'm a modern progressive and this Confucian shit is all this is all like patriarchal, hierarchical, it's oppressive and backwards. And it's like I mean, I'm not saying that there's not truth to that. I'm not saying that society shouldn't evolve and that we could treat each other better. We could treat, men and women and children better. I'm all about that. But at the same time, I don't want to look at it like glass half full, half empty, or glass half evil and backwards and, regressive. And the other half is like, like Korean people need to be more, or they need to be different. They need to change their ways or something like that. Maybe there's a part of me that feels that way. But my point being is I'm both Korean and American. In as much as like my life experiences have formed me, like the way I carry myself, the way I think about the world, some parts of me I realize like, oh, you know what, like maybe there's some part of my personality that is very Korean. I'm obviously a genetic mix of my mother and father who are very Korean, so I'm gonna have some of those, even though I'm a perfect native English speaker, right? That doesn't change the fact that I grew up with Korean parents, so their Korean ways are going to influence me no matter what. And so I affirm sorry, I'll finish up here. What I want to share with the world, other Korean Americans, Chinese Americans, Asian minorities worldwide, is that this is what I've come to. And I just wish that I could have listened to a conversation like this and someone could have shared this perspective, because I feel like it would have saved me a lot of time. It's like, we're all unique, we're all different. And I do feel privileged to have lived this life. It's not like a normal mainlander path, right? That, I grew up in America and then I came back to Korea, get in touch with my roots, blah, blah. So I am Korean like in all the ways that I am Korean. I affirm and love myself for who I am. I accept it. And at the same time, every part of me that's American, I'm proud of it and I'm grateful and I'm humbled to have that part of me. And at the same time, fuck everybody. I'm my own individual, and like I live my life for me. And so, don't put me in my box. And so like I try to find the yin and yang. In Korean we call it umyang. We try to, I want to accept this total balance. And I think actually that's very Korean of me, because in the Korean flag, the taegukgi, you have the blue and red yin yang symbol, right? So I feel like I'm embodying that Korean East Asian principle of harmony, the of wanting to resolve the identity confusion between Korean East and American West. And I think that actually in the past 10 years, like in the journey to find myself, I love myself now. Like I'm so proud of myself that I have that. And I just wish when I was 15, 16, I could have listened to some conversation instead of masturbating to porn all the time and playing video games. I wish I could have listened to this podcast. And two cool guys on their grind, making art, living their lives, doing really cool shit, speaking different languages. And I wish that I could have listened to this conversation, be like, oh, like these guys, they went through something similar to what I'm going through. And so like if these older brothers, these youngs, are doing this kind of thing and they have this perspective, then maybe I too, can change my life. Like I can go through transformation if I hate myself, or I feel like I'm really overweight, or I don't love myself, I don't understand my parents. I hate my ethnicity. I wish I was born white, or black, or all that bullshit. I just wish that someone had told me this. So I think I have this, this is just me being egotistical, but I think I have this great mental, spiritual framework of like how to like feel about yourself as a person, how to view yourself as a person of like, mixed identities, whether you're hyphenated or mixed blood or adoptee, like I think the principle of loving and accepting yourself, all parts of who you are, and allowing your accepting whatever part that you feel like you're lacking, like, oh, I didn't grow up speaking Korean, so I feel like I'm not Korean enough. It's just like, hey, that's okay. Like if anyone else was in your situation, they would feel similarly, blah blah blah. So anyways, going back to the Koreans, I feel like a lot of Korean people are very accepting. Some people view me as a foreigner, legally by nationality I am. But then some people are like, oh, you're Korean. Oh, and Korean people really respect my journey. Like when they listen to my story about how I came to Korea, not speaking Korean, and now I I registered a company in Korean. I do this paperwork in Korean, like I pay taxes and I'll do all this stuff. Like, dude, you're fucking Korean. You're living in this society and all this stuff. So thanks for hearing me ramble on a bit, Victor.
Of course.
But,
where in the US did you grow up?
North Carolina in elementary school, then a year in Kansas. And I would say my hometown is actually in Rhode Island. So I kind of identify as a New England boy. I would say, Rhode Island's my hometown. New England, East Coast.
Gotcha. No, and thanks for sharing that too. And I can also empathize, as, again, prefacing that I use all these terms generally, like as an East Asian American who identifies as both American and Chinese. And I feel like I like to encompass the best of both worlds. And I couldn't really imagine my life without it. Because, I like to think that the way I see the world, the way, as you said, sort of this respect for hierarchy, but also an appreciation for certain freedoms and individuality, and the best mix of the values of a collective identity, which I feel like most of East Asia sort of emphasizes, and then the cliches of individuality, I'm my own person, which we learn here in the American education system. So again, it's just the best of both worlds, right?
Victor, you're a miracle. You're fucking beautiful. I mean, really, because and just think about how fucking fortunate we are, that we can speak multiple languages. And we not everyone does it consciously necessarily, or think about it in those terms. But I like to think of that myself as well, taking the best of both worlds, the East and West. And we're so privileged to be in that position where we can do that, and that's an amazing thing. And especially in this modern world, in this 21st century, where we can travel and learn different languages and talk with people all over the world and pursue our arts, and connect even over a video call like this right now. Like, this is really inspiring, because think about our ancestors, bro. For thousands of years, they just spoke one language and they lived within the same 5 to 10 kilometers. I mean, when they weren't running away from war and famine and all that crazy shit. So we're lucky, and in a sense, like I don't disagree with those Chinese mainlanders who maybe judge like, oh, you can't have that, that's Chinese privilege. It is cheating. Our our families cheated, man. Our families got to America, and we were able to grow up in America, and with all the good and bad things associated with that, and we were able to learn the lingua franca of the world. We were able to learn English as our first language, and then to even go back to the mainland and connect with the motherland in Asia, our respective motherlands in Asia, and connect with those people, and share our stories. And we are privileged. We are privileged. And so I would like to make a public service announcement right here on the Mime Time Show. If you're like us, if you're like half Asian, half East Asian, or adoptee, or I don't want to trigger my adopted brothers and sisters and say they're privileged, but Asian Americans or Asian diaspora in general, if you have the connection to two different identities and languages and cultures, if you can really milk that, you're fucking privileged. And so I don't mean that to judge you, but what I mean is, like, if you feel like you're worthless, like I did, if you feel confused and worthless and you hate yourself and confused, you don't need to be. You can flip all that, you can transform all that negative energy into something life affirming and positive. It's like, oh, I have, my whole life, my whole childhood was like, oh, I hate myself for being Asian. Like, oh, kids call me chink and gook and whatever, and to go back to China. I'm not even Chinese. My parents don't even speak English. I hate them. Why can't they speak English? At least all the other kids in the neighborhood and class, they get to argue with their parents in English. At least they get to argue in this. I don't even have that. Life is so unfair. Oh, I hate myself. I want to kill myself. I genuinely thought like this. These were my thought patterns. It's really, and the beauty of it, the beauty of the fact that I can laugh at that now is, I had to go through that journey. And so what I want to encourage, like, if you have any of that negative resentment, I'm saying that, like, I know what that feels like, and that there is potentially a different way that maybe people in the community, people listening, can consider. So don't feel sorry for yourself. Be humbled and grateful and proud, of all that you are, all your families and whatever, whoever you are, wherever you are, and this, obviously these principles apply to, accepting and loving yourself for who you are is a universal principle that I think will apply to every individual, whether they're mainland Chinese, mainland Korean, or Korean American, ABC, what have you. And I'm just saying, yeah, we are privileged, bro. And so with a greater power comes a greater responsibility.
Yes, exactly.
And so it's with this privilege, I realize that I'm blessed. And so this is not something to make, oh yeah, I'm American. So there's a lot of motherfuckers, I won't name any cities, but people from LA, they come to Korea, Korean Americans, and then they'll be like, they have this, like, this swagger, like they may even speak Korean, but like they feel like they have the attitudes, like when they meet Korean people, they get like, they have an ego, like they're better than Koreans because they identify as American. And then some, when people assume I'm from the West Coast or from LA, like I get kind of embarrassed. I'm like, no, I'm not like one of those Gyopos who think they're better than all the other Koreans or whatever. And I'm not hating on my LA Gyopo brothers and sisters. I got lots of good friends there. But you know what I mean? It's just like, this is and because that egotism actually comes from I think a place of like ego separation, of course. And then it's just like, yeah, I don't know, it comes to a face like, because deep down they know that they are also Korean. And so, but they resent that. So I think they actually resent a part of themselves. And so that's why they have to have like the American ego, like they're the Westerner and they're the individualist. They're the enlightened Western American individualist. And these people, these Koreans, they're backwards. And so I don't want to be identified with them because that's scary. Because that I might have to identify a place in my own soul, in my own, like subconscious, some part of me that I don't accept being Korean. So I'm going to judge them and say like, oh, I'm American, I know things better about life and how women should be treated or something like that. But I'm saying, yeah, we're privileged. So we should do that we should take it with humility and gratitude and responsibility. I mean, at least that's how I want to live my life.
Make sure you
You know, I really appreciate that. And also just I might be misquoting him, but it might be Simu Liu who said that being Asian is a superpower. I don't know if he meant it in the context that we're thinking of, but that's why your sentiment entirely echoes mine. Sort of when some of my friends and acquaintances I met in mainland China will either saw it as a privilege or cheating that I have this hyphenated identity. I can see why, because we have access to two expansive, rich cultures that are all influential, and Korea, and that's a whole nother thing. And I'm almost envious because Korea, and I would say even more so than China, to be honest, like in terms of media and soft power, I think Korea has a leg up on China, to be quite frank. Because, and again, this is a whole big sensitive discussion, but you know, Korean shows, Korean music is more popular or generally more accepted outside of Asia compared to, you know, C-pop and C-dramas because of government censorship and that the government essentially controls all content creation in China. But, you know, Korea has figured it out, and Korea, and you know, we probably don't need to bother saying a list of successful shows and songs. There's way too many that come out of Korean media. So again, I'm envious that you have access to that culture in a way that I don't, so to speak. I
Yeah.
mean, if I could try, of course, like I could probably, you know, I would have to spend probably half a decade or a decade to kind of entrench myself into, you know, Korean culture, Japanese culture, if I wanted to become a part of that. But as you said, it's just, you know, you being Korean American, me being Chinese American, it's so cool that we sort of both personally, professionally have links to both these places. And I see both places as home. I'm very comfortable in both. And
Same.
I accept the yin and the yang in both.
Yeah, and so like in the end, like home is such a beautiful nebulous term, right? Like what is home? For me, home is, you know, it's Warwick, Rhode Island, the home, the small town that I spent most of my years in one place. But then I also moving around a lot. I moved a lot since I was a kid, and that was also traumatizing for me. But it was also later on I realized a great blessing because it taught me
Yeah.
how to make friends quickly and to not take things personally, blah blah blah. So like then in a sense, like you're home wherever you are, you know. And then when I come to Korea, I'm here in Korea, I feel very much at home. At the same time, like I'm a foreigner, and like this is weird. It's weird for me to, so it's a weird experience to be like, oh, this is home. I was born here. A lot of Korean Americans that are actually Korean American born, but I'm actually technically not that. I know my family left this country when I was a baby. So even though that's like a weird fact, like they could have lied to me. They could have just said like I was born in America or something, you know, for a while. But I feel like this is home. And then I really made it my home by me making lots of friends, making lots of connections, learning Korean, learning the culture. So, you know, it feels home, but also, so you have home in different ways. You have different homes, and we're lucky, we're privileged to have different homes and to feel at home wherever we are. And then, you know, and then whenever I go to other parts of Asia, when I go to Japan or Vietnam or whatever, you know, I don't feel like at home in that sense, but like I feel comfortable in that sense that like, oh, wherever I go, I'm, as long as I put out good vibes and I treat people well, people just, you know, embrace me with open arms, you know. And I would like to point out one thing, which is that I just you saying that, you know, saying, oh, you're jealous because like in the sense that I'm Korean and Korean has done so well in terms of soft power worldwide with, you know, K-pop dramas and blah 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 blah, entertainment media. You know, dude, when I was growing up in elementary school, literally nobody knew where the fuck Korea was. They had never even heard about Korea, right? In like elementary school. And then it's just like, you know, I heard this throughout my childhood, like, are you from North or South Korea? And
That
and
happens. I've seen that. I've
yeah,
witnessed that.
right. And then so you know, but and so like I remember in 2011, 13 or whatever, whenever size Gangnam Style blew up worldwide, right? Like that was one of the biggest things that happened where I was just like, oh my God, like people know about Korean culture more, or the Korean, you know,
Mm.
um media now more than ever. But like again, when I was a kid, everyone thought I was Chinese or Japanese. And now being
Mm.
Korean is the coolest flavor of Asian worldwide now. And so I find that in the course of my life, how that has if it's for me to make an egotistical like a parallel here, you know, in my own life I was very obscure, you know, like no one knew who I was, or who, I mean, who knows who I am, like who am I? But you know, like no one knew about Korea and like I was very shy and awkward. And then I came back to Korea, and Korea and culture, soft power has blown up worldwide. Now everyone knows about Korea. And
Mhm.
so in terms of like the how do I say, a form of recognition, like national global recognition, but also in terms of like I see a parallel between that and also my own story arc, my own personal journey, where like I had to, like I not that people recognize me, which they do, but like I recognize myself, and now, so anyways, like this is the best time to be Korean in Korean history, in your worldwide history. This is the best time wherever you are. If you're Korean and you feel sorry for yourself, like, not that you have to freaking like BTS or, really like bibimbap or something like that, but it's like you can fuck it, just use it. Just like you like take some of that energy, take some of that soft power, that when there's like a government funded programs, the soft power and whatever, just take it for what it is, and ride that privilege, and then use it for good, and in general, whether you're Chinese or Japanese or China, like Chinese, this is the Asian century in general. And so even though maybe the Chinese national media and entertainment aren't as hot as Korean media and entertainment, I still think it's a great time to be Chinese, in terms of like ethnic identity. I think because China has, in terms of like geopolitical and economic power, like has gained a lot of respect in the past several decades. And so it's not, of course, not, it's the four Asian tigers, right? And you
Mhm.
got Singapore. And so like this is really the Asian century in my eyes. Like I think Asia's a shit. I love all Asian peoples because we're similar and we look the same, East Asians anyways. And so like we
Mhm.
can, like I kind of want to take that pan-Asian identity in America, and then I kind of just want to decentralize and globalize it even more and reach out to not just like our Asian American brothers and sisters, but like I've met Koreans from all over the world, Koreans who grew up in Russia, Koreans who grew up in Japan, their first language is Japanese, Koreans who grew up in Germany, right? And so one of my favorite um, gyopos, or Korean diaspora brothers that I know, his name is Aaron Kim, and I interviewed him for my podcast. And he's Korean German, so he speaks Korean and German and English fluently, and some French. He's had a very interesting life. He surfed all around the world, running away from his problems, working in finance, working in New York, and working in Hong Kong. Traveled, partied, surfed all over the world, and now he married a wonderful woman, and they have 4 kids, and they speak Korean, German, and English to each other.
That's wild. Yeah.
It's wild. And
Yeah.
so like they maintain, and they're here in Korea, and like they maintain that identity. Like he when I met him, like I almost cried because of the way he treated his kids. Like he told them that he loved them. He was a very Korean father, but he was also very like open and direct. And the way he was, like he was authoritative as a father, but also like loving, caring, and understanding. And so like I
Mhm.
felt like, wow, this guy, he told me like he wants to bring the best of both, like his German upbringing and the best of German, European, Western culture, as well as the good sides of Korean culture. And like I see his kids, they're so privileged. I'm like, just like, man, these kids, they love their father and he loves them. Like they're
Mhm.
amazing, So this is we're privileged. And yeah, and so and maybe there's some Chinese ABC right now. It's just like, oh, I wish I was Korean, which is the greatest fucking irony. Because when I was a kid, I wished I was fuck being Korean. I wish I was Japanese or Chinese, because Japanese, they got anime and karate or whatever, right? And Chinese got like kung fu and Bruce Lee and Jackie Chan. But what am I? What kind of famous Korean role models there for me to look up to? But now there are tons. It's funny how life works out, and it's funny how like the the destiny of nations and geopolitics and worldwide perceptions of different peoples, like how this all plays into our individual lives. So I would just say, like, whoever you are, just go with it. Just like be humble, be grateful, be proud of who you are. And if you're
Mhm.
just listening to us, to me and Victor, just like, we're just living our lives, being motherfucking gods, mate. Like, we're just normal dudes. I think you're a normal dude.
I
I
mean,
don't, you don't,
I
you,
take
yeah.